I was in the kitchen with my mom, getting everything ready for Christmas dinner. The house was warm, filled with the smell of cinnamon and roasting turkey. We had been cooking all day, and I was excited to see everyone later. My mom was working on her famous apple pie while I was in charge of the sides. I had a big pot of water on the stove, waiting for it to boil so I could start on the mashed potatoes. The kitchen was cramped with all the dishes and ingredients spread out. I was trying to reach for the salt shaker on the top shelf when I accidentally bumped into the handle of the pot. It happened so fast. 1 second I was stretching my arm, and the next, I felt this intense heat on my legs. The pot had tipped over, and boiling water was pouring down my thighs and calves. I screamed. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before. This searing, all-consuming pain that seemed to get worse with each passing second. My mom turned around and her eyes went wide. She started yelling for help, and I could hear the panic in her voice. I was frozen in place, unable to move as the pain intensified. My skin felt like it was on fire, and I could see it turning an angry red color. My dad and brother rushed into the kitchen. Everything was a blur of movement and noise. Someone grabbed a towel and tried to pat my legs dry, but even that light touch was excruciating. I remember thinking how surreal it all was. The Christmas tree lights blinking in the living room, the half-finished pie on the counter, and me standing there in agony. They helped me to a chair, and I could barely sit still. The pain was unbearable, and I kept thinking about how I had ruined Christmas. My mom was on the phone, her voice shaky as she explained what happened to the emergency services. I heard her say severe burns and need an ambulance, and that's when the reality of the situation hit me. My brother was trying to keep me calm, telling me to take deep breaths, but all I could focus on was the throbbing pain in my legs. I glanced down and immediately regretted it. My skin was blistering already, and in some places it looked like it had been scraped off entirely. The sight made me feel dizzy and nauseous. We could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. My dad was pacing, looking out the window every few seconds. The wait felt like hours, even though it was probably only a few minutes. When the paramedics finally arrived, their presence seemed to fill our small house. They asked me questions, but I could barely form coherent answers through the pain. They applied some kind of cooling gel to my legs, which provided a moment of relief before the burning sensation returned full force. As they were preparing to move me to the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of our living room. The presents under the tree, the stockings hung by the fireplace. It all looked so normal, so festive. It was such a stark contrast to what was happening to me. The journey to the hospital was a nightmare. Every bump in the road sent waves of pain through my body. The paramedic kept talking to me, trying to keep me distracted, but all I could think about was the searing pain and the fact that I was missing Christmas Eve with my family. When we arrived at the ER, it was chaos. Despite it being Christmas Eve, the place was packed. I was wheeled past other patients, some looking at me with pity, others too caught up in their own emergencies to notice. The bright fluorescent lights made everything seem harsh and clinical. A doctor examined my burns almost immediately. He spoke in a calm, professional tone, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He explained that I had second and third degree burns on both legs. The words, possible skin grafts and extended hospital stay, floated around me, but I couldn't fully process what they meant. The next few hours were a blur of pain medication, more examinations, and treatments I didn't fully understand. They cleaned my burns, which was possibly even more painful than the initial injury. I gritted my teeth and tried to hold back tears, but it was too much. I cried openly as nurses wrapped my legs in sterile bandages. My family was allowed to see me briefly. My mom's eyes were red and puffy, and my dad looked pale and shaken. They tried to reassure me, telling me everything would be okay, but I could see the worry etched on their faces. My brother attempted a weak joke about me trying to get out of doing the dishes, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. As the pain medication started to kick in, the world became a bit hazy. I remember staring at the ceiling, counting the tiles to distract myself from the constant throbbing in my legs. The hospital sounds, beeping machines, squeaking shoes on linoleum, muffled conversations, all blended together into a strange, unsettling symphony. A nurse came in to check on me, adjusting my IV and asking about my pain levels. She mentioned something about staying overnight for observation, and possibly longer depending on how my burns progressed. The reality of spending Christmas in the hospital started to sink in. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. We were all gathered in my parents' living room for our annual Christmas karaoke party. The tree lights were twinkling, and everyone was in high spirits. My mom had just finished belting out her favorite Mariah Carey song, and we were all laughing and cheering. It was supposed to be a night of fun and family bonding, but it turned into something I'll never forget. I noticed something was off when my mom went to sit down. She stumbled a bit, which wasn't like her at all. She hadn't been drinking, so I thought maybe she just tripped on the rug. But then she started to speak, and that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Her words came out all jumbled, like she was speaking a foreign language. At first I thought she was joking around, maybe trying to imitate some of the lyrics she'd just sung. But the look on her face told a different story. Her eyes were wide, and she seemed confused and scared. My dad was the first to react. He went over to her, asking if she was okay. But she couldn't respond properly. She just kept making these strange sounds, her mouth moving but nothing coherent coming out. That's when the panic started to set in. I remember looking around the room, seeing the confusion and fear on everyone's faces. My aunt asked if my mom was having some kind of allergic reaction. Someone else suggested she might be choking. But deep down, I think we all knew it was something much worse. My sister, who's a nurse, suddenly shouted that we needed to call an ambulance. She said something about fast, face, arms, speech, time. That's when it hit me. My mom was having a stroke. Right there, in the middle of our Christmas party. Everything after that seemed to happen in slow motion. My dad fumbled with his phone trying to dial 911. His hands were shaking so much he could barely hit the numbers. I could hear him talking to the operator, his voice cracking as he described what was happening. Meanwhile, my sister had moved my mom to the couch. She was checking her vitals, asking her to smile, to raise her arms. But my mom couldn't do any of it properly. Her left side seemed weak and her face was drooping on one side. It was like watching a horror movie, except it was happening right in front of me, to someone I love. The wait for the ambulance felt like an eternity. We were all just standing there, watching helplessly as my mom's condition seemed to get worse by the minute. She tried to speak a few times, but it was just gibberish. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it was tearing me apart. I remember looking at the Christmas tree, the presents still wrapped underneath, the half-eaten snacks on the coffee table. Everything looked so normal, so festive. It was such a stark contrast to the nightmare that was unfolding. When we finally heard the sirens, it was like a weight had been lifted. But then the paramedics rushed in and reality hit hard again. They started asking questions, checking my mom's vitals, hooking her up to machines. Our living room, which had been filled with laughter and music just a short while ago, now looked like a makeshift emergency room. They decided to take her to the hospital right away. As they were loading her onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked so small and vulnerable, nothing like the strong, vibrant woman who had been singing karaoke just an hour before. Only one person could ride in the ambulance with her, so my dad went. The rest of us had to follow in our cars. I remember the drive to the hospital, how surreal it felt. Christmas lights were twinkling on houses we passed, and I could see families through windows enjoying their holiday. It felt like we were in a completely different world. At the hospital, everything was a blur of white walls and fluorescent lights. We were directed to a waiting area while they took my mom for tests. The cheerful Christmas decorations in the hospital lobby seemed out of place, almost mocking. Time seemed to stand still as we waited for news. Every time a doctor or nurse walked by, we'd all look up, hoping for some information. But for what felt like hours, we heard nothing. Finally, a doctor came to speak with us. He explained that my mom had indeed suffered a stroke. They were doing everything they could, but the next 24 hours would be critical. He used a lot of medical terms I didn't understand, But the gravity of the situation was clear. As he was talking, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. Just a few hours ago, we were all together, laughing and singing. Now we were in a hospital on Christmas Eve, not knowing if my mom would recover or what kind of life she might have if she did. The doctor asked if we had any questions, but my mind was blank. What do you ask in a situation like this? How do you process something so unexpected and terrifying? We were allowed to see her briefly before they took her to the ICU. She was hooked up to so many machines, tubes, and wires. Her face was still drooping on one side, and her eyes were closed. I wanted to say something to her to let her know we were there, but words failed me. I was up on our roof trying to get the Christmas lights just right. You know how it is. Every year you want the house to look better than the last. The weather was crisp, and I could see my breath in the air. I'd been putting this off for days, but with Christmas just around the corner, I knew I had to get it done. The ladder was propped against the side of the house. It was the same old aluminum one we'd had for years. I'd used it countless times for various projects, so I didn't think twice about it. I remember checking to make sure it was steady before I climbed up. It seemed fine. I had a box of lights in one hand and some clips in the other as I made my way up. The rungs were cold against my hands, and I could feel the slight give of the ladder with each step. But that was normal, right? I'd always felt that. Once I got to the roof, I started working on the lights. I was trying to get them to line up perfectly along the edge. It's funny how focused you can get on something so trivial. I was completely absorbed in the task, making sure each bulb was evenly spaced. I could hear my kids playing in the front yard. They were excited about the lights, kept asking when they'd be able to turn them on. I promised them we'd do it that evening if I could finish up in time. Their laughter drifted up to where I was working, and I remember smiling to myself. As I was reaching to secure a section of lights, I felt a slight shift. At first, I thought it was just me losing my balance a bit. You know how sometimes you get that sudden feeling of vertigo when you're up high? It was like that, but then it didn't stop. I realized the ladder was moving. Not just a little wobble, but really moving. I tried to grab onto the gutter, but my hands were full of lights and clips. Everything happened so fast after that. The ladder slipped away from the house. I felt this moment of weightlessness, like when you miss a step going downstairs, but 100 times worse. My stomach lurched, and for a split second, I couldn't believe what was happening. Then I was falling. The ground was rushing up towards me, and all I could think was, this is going to hurt. I saw the concrete driveway coming at me, and I had this fleeting thought that if I hit that, I might not survive. I hit the ground with a force I can't even describe. It wasn't like falling off a bike or tripping on the sidewalk. This was a whole different level of impact. I landed on my side, and I heard this sickening crunch. At first there was just shock. Then the pain hit. It was everywhere. My legs, my arms, my back. Everything hurt in a way I'd never experienced before. I couldn't move. I just lay there trying to breathe, but even that was excruciating. Each breath felt like someone was stabbing me in the chest. I could hear screaming, and it took me a moment to realize it was my kids. They'd seen the whole thing. I wanted to tell them I was okay, to calm them down, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything but lie there and try to stay conscious. The pain was getting worse with each passing second. I tried to assess the damage, but moving even slightly sent waves of agony through my body. I could taste blood in my mouth and my vision was blurry. I remember thinking, is this how it ends? Putting up Christmas lights? I heard my wife's voice, panicked and shrill. She must have run out of the house when she heard the commotion. I wanted to reassure her, but all I could manage was a groan. I heard her telling the kids to go inside, then felt her kneel beside me. She was asking me questions, but I couldn't focus enough to answer. The pain was overwhelming, consuming every thought. I could hear her on the phone, her voice shaking as she called for an ambulance. The concrete was cold against my cheek, and I realized I was shivering. Shock, probably. Time seemed to stretch. I don't know how long I lay there, but it felt like hours. Every second was agony. I kept thinking about my kids, how terrified they must be. I wanted to get up, to show them I was fine, but I knew I wasn't. I couldn't even roll over. When I heard the sirens, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that help was coming, but dread at the thought of being moved. The paramedics arrived and I could hear them talking, but their words didn't make sense. It was like they were speaking underwater. They started to assess me, asking questions. I tried to answer, but forming words was difficult. Every touch sent new waves of pain through my body. They were gentle, but even the slightest movement was excruciating. I remember them mentioning something about possible spinal injuries and the need for immobilization. They placed a neck brace on me and the pressure made me feel like I couldn't breathe. Then they carefully rolled me onto a backboard. The pain was indescribable. I think I might have passed out for a moment. We were at the big hill behind our neighborhood on Christmas morning. The kids had been begging to go sledding since they woke up, and with all the new snow we'd gotten, it seemed like the perfect way to start the day. I remember thinking how beautiful everything looked, all white and sparkling in the morning sun. The hill was pretty busy. Lots of other families had the same idea. Kids were laughing and shouting as they zoomed down the slope. We found a spot that wasn't too crowded and started unpacking our sleds. The air was crisp and cold, and I could see my breath forming little clouds as I helped the kids get ready. My oldest was eager to go first. He's always been the daredevil of the family. I watched him race down the hill, his red hat a bright spot against the snow. He made it look so easy, gliding smoothly all the way to the bottom. When he got back up, he was grinning from ear to ear, cheeks flushed with excitement. My youngest was next. He's usually more cautious, but seeing his brother's successful run had him raring to go. I helped him onto the sled, made sure he was sitting properly. I remember telling him to hold on tight and to keep his feet up. He nodded, looking both excited and a little nervous. I gave him a gentle push and off he went. At first, everything seemed fine. He was sliding down smoothly, picking up speed. I was watching him, feeling proud of how brave he was being. That's when I noticed something wasn't right. His sled started to veer off the main path. I couldn't see why at first, but then I spotted it. A dark spot in the snow that hadn't been visible from the top. Before I could even shout a warning, his sled hit it hard. The impact launched him off the sled. It was like watching in slow motion. His little body flew through the air, arms and legs flailing. I started running down the hill, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I saw him hit the ground and start tumbling. He was rolling so fast, bouncing off the hard-packed snow. Each time he hit, I winced, imagining how much it must hurt. But the worst was when I saw his head strike a patch of ice. The sound it made. I'll never forget it. It was a dull thud that seemed to echo across the hill. Finally, he came to a stop near the bottom of the hill. He wasn't moving. The silence was deafening. All the laughter and shouts from the other kids seemed to fade away. All I could focus on was my son's small, still form lying in the snow. I reached him, out of breath and shaking. He was face down in the snow, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell if he was breathing. I gently turned him over, trying to remember everything I'd ever learned about not moving someone who might have a spinal injury. But in that moment, all that knowledge seemed to slip away. His face was so pale, almost as white as the snow around him. There was a nasty gash on his forehead, and blood was starting to trickle down his face, stark red against his pale skin. His eyes were closed, and he wasn't responding to my voice. I started yelling for help, my voice sounding strange and panicked even to my own ears. Some of the other parents rushed over. Someone asked if I wanted them to call 911, and I nodded, unable to form words. My older son had made it down the hill by then, and I could hear him crying, asking what happened to his brother. I was trying to check my youngest for other injuries, but my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly manage it. I kept talking to him, begging him to wake up, to open his eyes, to give me any sign that he could hear me. But he remained still and unresponsive. Someone draped a coat over him, and another person was on the phone with emergency services. I could hear them describing our location, emphasizing that we needed a helicopter because an ambulance wouldn't be able to reach us quickly enough on the snowy roads. The wait for help felt endless. I was holding my son's hand, trying to warm it between my own. His skin felt so cold, and I was terrified of what that might mean. I kept checking his breathing, relief washing over me each time I felt the faint rise and fall of his chest. The wind had picked up, and snow was starting to fall again. I was hunched over my son, trying to shield him from the elements. My older son was huddled next to me, silent now but still crying. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words when I wasn't sure they were true. I don't know how long we waited there in the snow. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Every second felt like an eternity, yet it also felt like no time had passed at all. I kept replaying the accident in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if I could have prevented this somehow. We were all in the living room, surrounded by wrapping paper and half-open presents. The Christmas tree lights were twinkling, and the kids were playing with their new toys. I was sitting on the couch, helping my youngest unwrap a big box. The room was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the cold winter morning outside. My wife was in the kitchen, getting some hot chocolate ready for everyone. I could hear the kettle whistling and the clinking of mugs. The older kids were sprawled out on the floor, already engrossed in their new video games. My parents were sitting in the armchairs watching the scene with contented smiles on their faces. I remember thinking how perfect everything was. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and everyone was happy and relaxed. It was one of those moments you wish you could freeze in time, you know? Just hold on to it forever. I had just finished helping my youngest open his present. It was a big Lego set he'd been asking for all year. He was so excited, his eyes wide as he looked at all the pieces. I was about to start helping him open the box when I heard it. At first I thought it was thunder. It was this deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But it kept getting louder. And then there was this horrible screeching noise. Before I could even process what was happening, there was an enormous crash. The whole house shook. I mean, it literally felt like an earthquake. Pictures fell off the walls, and the Christmas tree toppled over. For a split second, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I saw the wall of our living room start to cave in, bricks and plaster flying everywhere. And then suddenly, there was a car in our living room, just there, where our TV had been a moment ago. There was now the front end of a sedan, crushed and steaming. The windshield was shattered, and I could see the airbags had deployed. It took me a few seconds to really understand what I was seeing. My brain just couldn't process it. How could there be a car in our living room? It didn't make any sense. But as the dust started to settle, the reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked around frantically, trying to locate everyone. My parents were still in their chairs, looking stunned. They were covered in dust and bits of drywall, but they seemed okay. My older kids had been knocked over by the impact, but they were already starting to sit up, looking dazed and confused. But I couldn't see my youngest. He had been right next to me on the couch, and now he was just gone. I started calling out for him, my voice sounding strange and panicked in the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. I could hear my wife screaming from the kitchen, asking what had happened, but I couldn't answer her. I was too focused on finding my son. I started digging through the debris around the couch, tossing aside pieces of brick and chunks of drywall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip anything. I kept thinking about how small he was, how easily he could have been crushed by the falling debris. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, I heard a small whimper coming from behind the overturned Christmas tree. I rushed over, nearly tripping over the tangled lights, and there he was. He had somehow ended up wedged between the tree and the wall, protected from the worst of the debris. I pulled him out, checking him over for injuries. He was crying, his face streaked with dust and tears, but he seemed largely unhurt. I hugged him close, feeling his little heart racing against my chest. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear as I realized how close we had come to losing him. As I turned back to the rest of the room, still clutching my son, I saw the driver of the car starting to move. He was slumped over the steering wheel, but he was clearly alive. As he lifted his head, I could smell the alcohol on him from across the room. His eyes were unfocused, and he was mumbling something I couldn't understand. I felt a surge of anger so intense it almost frightened me. This man had nearly killed my family. He had destroyed our home, ruined our Christmas, and came terrifyingly close to taking my son from me, all because he decided to drive drunk. My wife had made it into the living room by this point. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale with shock as she took in the scene. The mug of hot chocolate she had been holding was shattered at her feet, the dark liquid seeping into the carpet. I handed our youngest to her, telling her to take him and the other kids out of the house. I didn't want them anywhere near this man or the unstable structure of our damaged home. She nodded, still seeming dazed, and started gathering the children. As they were leaving, I turned back to the driver. He was trying to open his door now, fumbling with the handle. I didn't know if I should help him or not. Part of me wanted to leave him there, trapped in the wreckage he had caused, but I knew I couldn't do that. I approached the car cautiously, aware that it might not be stable. The front end was crumpled like an accordion, steam hissing from the damaged engine. I could smell gasoline, and a small voice in the back of my mind warned me about the risk of fire. When I reached the driver's side door, I could see the man more clearly. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a beard. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a cut on his forehead that was bleeding pretty badly. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. I managed to get the door open after a few tries. The frame was bent and it screeched in protest as I forced it. The smell of alcohol was even stronger now, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid odor of deployed airbags. The man tried to speak to me, his words slurred and barely intelligible. I caught fragments about being sorry and not meaning to, but I wasn't really listening. All I could think about was how close he had come to killing my family. I helped him out of the car, my movements mechanical. I knew I needed to get him away from the vehicle in case it caught fire, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get as far away from this man as possible. As we stumbled away from the wreckage, I could hear sirens in the distance. Someone must have called 911. I felt a wave of relief knowing that help was on the way, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization of just how much damage had been done. Our living room was destroyed. The wall where the car had come through was just gone. Bricks and debris were scattered everywhere. Our Christmas tree was lying on its side, ornaments shattered and presents crushed beneath it. The couch where I had been sitting with my son was pushed up against the far wall, split nearly in half by the force of the impact. We were all in the living room watching Christmas movies. It was something we did every year, you know? Just a normal family tradition. The lights on the tree were twinkling, and we had a fire going in the fireplace. It was cozy, warm. We were watching It's a Wonderful Life, my dad's favorite. I remember I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch. My mom and sister were on the couch, and my dad was in his favorite armchair. We had blankets, hot cocoa, the whole deal. It was just nice, comfortable, normal. We were about halfway through the movie when I noticed my dad shifting in his chair. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was always fidgeting, you know? But then I saw him rubbing his left arm. He had this weird look on his face, like he was confused or something. I was about to ask if he was okay when he suddenly made this strange noise. It was like a gasp, but deeper, rougher. Then he just fell forward, right out of his chair. He hit the coffee table on the way down, knocking over mugs and sending popcorn flying everywhere. For a second, we all just froze. It was like our brains couldn't process what had just happened. Then my mom started screaming. She was calling my dad's name over and over. My sister was just staring, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I don't remember getting up, but suddenly I was kneeling next to my dad. He was face down on the carpet. I rolled him over and, God, his face. It was all twisted up like he was in pain. His eyes were open, but they looked wrong, unfocused. I shook him, called his name. Nothing. No response. I put my hand on his chest, trying to feel if he was breathing. I couldn't tell. Everything was so chaotic. My mom was still screaming. My sister was crying now. I could barely think straight. I remembered something about checking for a pulse. I pressed my fingers against his neck, the way they show in movies. I couldn't feel anything. Or maybe I could? I wasn't sure. My hands were shaking so bad. That's when it hit me. He wasn't breathing. My dad wasn't breathing. I yelled at my sister to call 911. She just stared at me for a second before scrambling for her phone. I could hear her voice, shaky and terrified, as she talked to the dispatcher. I knew I had to do something. I'd taken a CPR class in high school, but that was years ago. I tried to remember what they taught us. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, right? Or was it 15 and 1? I couldn't remember. I started doing compressions anyway. I put my hands on his chest and started pushing. Hard and fast, like they said. It was weird. Not like in the movies at all. I could feel his ribs moving under my hands. It scared me, but I knew I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I did compressions before I remembered the rescue breaths. I tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and blew into his mouth. His chest rose, but then just fell. No response. I did it again. Still nothing. Back to compressions. Push, push, push. My arms were already getting tired. I was counting out loud, trying to keep the rhythm. 15, 16, 17. I could hear my mom praying behind me. My sister was still on the phone, her voice high and panicky. I kept going. Compressions, breaths, over and over. My dad's face was changing color. It was turning this grayish blue. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was terrifying. My arms were burning. Sweat was dripping down my face. I was breathing hard, almost panting, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I stopped, my dad might. I couldn't even think it, so I just kept going. I don't know how long I did CPR. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Time got all twisted up. The only thing that existed was the rhythm. Push, 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 breathe, breathe, push, push, push. At some point, I noticed my dad's lips were turning blue. Really blue. It was such a stark contrast to his pale skin. I'd never seen anything like it. It made everything feel even more urgent, more terrifying. I was getting so tired. My arms felt like lead. Each compression was a struggle. I was scared I wasn't pushing hard enough anymore. But I couldn't stop. I just couldn't. I kept talking to my dad, begging him to breathe, to wake up, to do anything. But there was no response. Just the awful stillness of his body under my hands. I could hear sirens in the distance. They seemed so far away. Too far. I pushed harder, faster. My muscles were screaming at me to stop, but I ignored them. The sirens were getting louder, but they still weren't here. My vision was starting to blur. From sweat or tears, I'm not sure. Probably both. I blinked hard, trying to clear it. I couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. The sound of the sirens was getting louder. They were close now, so close. But still not here. I kept going. Push, push, push. Breathe, breathe, over and over. I was so focused on the CPR that I didn't hear the paramedics come in. Suddenly, there were hands on my shoulders pulling me back. I tried to resist at first. I didn't want to stop, but they were insistent. As they pulled me away, I saw my dad clearly for the first time since I'd started CPR. He looked awful. His skin was gray, his lips blue. His eyes were still open, staring at nothing. It didn't look like my dad anymore. It looked like the paramedics swarmed around him. They were moving so fast, their hands a blur as they worked. One of them ripped open my dad's shirt. Another was setting up some kind of machine. There were wires everywhere. I watched as they put pads on my dad's chest. Someone yelled, "Clear," and my dad's body jerked. It was violent, unnatural. They did it again, and again. I could hear the machine making this high-pitched whine each time. They were doing CPR now, but it looked so different from what I'd been doing. So much more efficient, mechanical. One of them had a bag mask over my dad's face, squeezing it rhythmically. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. It was like they were speaking a different language. Medical terms, numbers, things I didn't understand. Their voices were calm, professional, so different from the chaos in my head. As they wheeled him out, I caught one last glimpse of my dad's face. It was the same as before, unresponsive, lifeless. And then they were gone, out the door and into the ambulance. We were all sitting around the dinner table enjoying our Christmas meal. The house was warm, filled with the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon from the apple pie cooling in the kitchen. My mom had outdone herself this year, and everyone was in good spirits. Well, almost everyone. My sister seemed a bit on edge. She kept glancing at her phone, then quickly putting it away. I didn't think much of it at first. I was too busy trying to avoid my aunt's questions about my personal life and future plans. The conversation flowed, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional burst of laughter. My dad was in the middle of telling one of his corny jokes when the doorbell rang. It was sharp, insistent, not the kind of ring you'd expect on Christmas Day. My mom looked confused and asked if we were expecting anyone else. We all shook our heads. My sister's face had gone pale. She mumbled something inaudible and got up from the table. I heard the front door open, then my sister's voice. She sounded upset. There was another voice too, a man's voice, slurred and angry. My stomach dropped. I recognized that voice. It was my sister's ex-boyfriend. The voices got louder. I could hear my sister trying to get him to leave, but he wasn't listening. Their voices got closer, and then they were in the dining room. He stumbled in, eyes bloodshot, clothes disheveled. The smell of alcohol hit me like a wave. He was swaying on his feet, looking around the room with unfocused eyes. My sister was right behind him, her face a mix of anger and fear. For a moment, everything was silent. Then my dad stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He firmly but calmly told the ex-boyfriend to leave, emphasizing that this was a family dinner, and he wasn't welcome. The ex-boyfriend laughed. It was an ugly sound, nothing like the laugh I remembered from when he and my sister were together. He made a sarcastic comment about our family dinner and took a step forward. I saw my dad tense up. My mom started ushering the younger kids out of the room. My aunt was frozen in her seat, her eyes wide with fear. I stood up slowly, not sure what to do, but knowing I needed to do something. That's when he pulled out the knife. It wasn't a big knife, probably just a pocket knife, but in that moment it looked enormous. The blade gleamed in the soft light of the dining room, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. He waved the knife around, ordering everyone not to move. His movements were erratic, unpredictable. He declared that we were all going to sit down and have a family chat. My sister was pleading with him now, her voice trembling. She was trying to reason with him, urging him to put the knife down and talk, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, darting around the room. I glanced at my dad. He was looking at me, his eyes flicking towards the kitchen. I understood. The phone was in there. We needed to call the police. I started inching towards the kitchen, trying to move as slowly and naturally as possible. The ex-boyfriend was focused on my sister and dad, waving the knife between them. I made it to the doorway of the kitchen when he suddenly turned towards me. He aggressively questioned where I was going. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. He reiterated his order for nobody to move. I raised my hands, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. I lied about going to get some water, claiming it was hot in the room. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then nodded. He allowed me to go, but warned me not to try anything. I walked into the kitchen on shaky legs. As soon as I was out of sight, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. I spoke in a whisper, quickly explaining the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way and told me to stay on the line if possible. I filled a glass with water and walked back to the dining room, the phone hidden behind my back. I set the glass down on the table and resumed my position, trying to look calm despite the fear coursing through me. The situation in the dining room had escalated. The ex-boyfriend was shouting now, accusing my sister of ruining his life. He was gesticulating wildly with the knife, causing everyone to flinch every time it came close. My dad was trying to calm him down, speaking in a low, soothing voice, but it wasn't working. If anything, it seemed to be making him angrier. He turned on my dad, pointing the knife directly at him. He started yelling about how we thought we were better than him, mocking our perfect little house and perfect little Christmas. His words were filled with bitterness and rage. I could hear sirens in the distance. They were faint but getting louder. The ex-boyfriend heard them too. His head snapped towards the window, his whole body tensing. He demanded to know who had called the cops, his voice rising to a shout. Nobody answered. We all just stared at him, frozen in fear. The sirens were getting closer now, unmistakable. He started pacing, muttering to himself. The knife was still in his hand, and every movement sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't know what he might do now that he felt cornered. The sirens were very close now. We could see the flashing lights through the windows. The ex-boyfriend let out a strangled yell and lunged towards my sister. Everything happened so fast after that. My dad jumped in front of my sister. There was a scuffle. I heard my mom scream, and then the front door burst open. Police officers flooded into the room, their guns drawn. They were shouting commands, telling everyone to get down, to put their hands up. I dropped to the floor, my hands over my head. There was more shouting, the sound of a struggle, and then, suddenly, it was quiet. I looked up slowly. The ex-boyfriend was on the ground, handcuffed. Police officers were everywhere, checking on everyone, asking if we were okay. One of the officers approached me, asking if I was the one who made the call. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. He thanked me, assuring me I had done the right thing. It was Christmas afternoon, and I was out in the backyard with my new drone. I'd been begging for one for months, and my parents finally caved. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just enough of a breeze to make flying interesting. I'd spent the morning reading the manual and watching tutorial videos, so I felt pretty confident. The drone was sleek and black, with bright LED lights that blinked when I turned it on. The controller felt solid in my hands as I carefully lifted off for the first time. At first, I kept it low, just a few feet off the ground. The camera feed on my phone screen was crystal clear, showing me a bird's eye view of our yard. I could see the patchy grass, the old swing set we never used anymore, and the big oak tree at the back of the property. As I got more comfortable, I started pushing the drone higher and faster. The buzz of the propellers was oddly satisfying as I zipped around the yard. I practiced figure eights around the trees, and even managed to flip without crashing. My cousin came out to watch. He's a few years younger than me and was fascinated by the drone. I could see him following it with his eyes, his head tilted back as I flew higher and higher. That's when I decided to really test the drone's limits. I pushed it up above the treetops, marveling at how small everything looked on my screen. Our house, the yard, even the neighbor's pool. It all seemed like a miniature model from up there. I was so focused on the screen that I almost didn't notice how close I was getting to the old shed at the back of our property. It was a decrepit thing, barely standing with a rusty metal roof. As I zoomed in with the camera, I noticed something odd on one of the beams supporting the roof overhang. It looked like a large, gray, papery ball. I'd never noticed it before, and curiosity got the better of me. I inched the drone closer, trying to get a better look. The ball was actually moving slightly, pulsing almost. That's when I realized what it was: a hornet's nest. I knew I should back off, but I couldn't resist getting just a little closer. I wanted to see if I could make out individual hornets on the surface of the nest. The drone's camera was so good, I thought I might be able to. That's when it happened. A gust of wind caught the drone, pushing it slightly to the side. I overcorrected, and before I could stop it, the drone smacked right into the nest. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the air around the nest seemed to explode with angry hornets. Through the camera, I could see them swarming around the drone, their bodies hitting the lens. I panicked and hit the return home button, but it was too late. The drone, confused by the impacts of the hornets, started to spiral out of control. It careened away from the shed, hornets in pursuit heading straight for us. I yelled at my cousin to run, but he seemed frozen in place, staring up at the approaching swarm. The drone crashed into the grass about 20 feet away from us, and that's when the full force of the hornets hit. They were everywhere, in my hair, on my clothes, buzzing around my face. I swatted frantically, feeling stings on my arms and neck. My cousin finally snapped out of his daze and started running towards the house, but he was slower than me. I reached the back door first, yanking it open and diving inside. I turned to pull my cousin in after me, and that's when I remembered. He was allergic to bee stings, and hornets were way worse than bees. He stumbled through the door, already gasping for breath. His face was starting to swell and he was clawing at his throat. I screamed for help and my family came running from the living room. My aunt took one look at my cousin and went pale. She ran for his backpack, where he kept his EpiPen. The rest of us tried to swat away the few hornets that had followed us inside, while my cousin wheezed on the floor. His breathing was getting worse by the second. His lips were turning blue, and his eyes were wide with panic. My aunt finally found the EpiPen and rushed back, but her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't get the cap off. I grabbed it from her, yanked off the cap, and jabbed it into my cousin's thigh, just like they taught us in first aid class. We all held our breath, waiting to see if it would work. For a few terrifying seconds, nothing changed. Then gradually, his breathing started to ease. The blue tinge faded from his lips, and some of the swelling in his face went down. We all let out a collective sigh of relief. But we weren't out of the woods yet. My cousin was still covered in stings, and so was I. The pain was really setting in now, a burning sensation all over my skin. I could feel my own face starting to puff up, though thankfully not as severely as my cousin's had. My mom was on the phone with 911 describing the situation. I could hear the panic in her voice as she tried to explain what had happened. The operator must have told her to check how many stings we had, because she started trying to count them on my cousin's arms. I looked down at my own arms and felt sick. They were covered in angry red welts, each one pulsing with pain. I hadn't even realized I'd been stung so many times in those few frantic seconds outside. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most welcome noise I'd ever heard. As they got closer, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. What was supposed to be a fun Christmas afternoon had turned into a nightmare in a matter of minutes. Paramedics burst through the front door, equipment in hand. They went straight for my cousin, checking his vitals and peppering us with questions. How long ago did he get stung? How long after the stings did we use the EpiPen? Was this his first anaphylactic reaction? I tried to answer as best I could, but everything was a blur. The paramedics worked quickly, hooking my cousin up to machines and starting an IV. They were concerned about a secondary reaction, apparently common with anaphylaxis. As they loaded my cousin onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics turned to me. He started examining my stings, asking if I was having trouble breathing or feeling lightheaded. I shook my head, but winced as he prodded one of the larger welts on my arm. The paramedic explained that while my reaction wasn't as severe as my cousin's, I'd still need to come to the hospital for observation. The number of stings I'd received put me at risk for a more serious reaction. As we moved towards the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of the backyard through the open door. The drone lay forgotten in the grass, and I could still see hornets buzzing angrily around it. The nest on the shed was a seething mass of activity, barely visible through the cloud of insects surrounding it. The last thing I saw before the paramedics ushered me into the ambulance was my dad, armed with a can of hornet spray, cautiously approaching the fallen drone. We were all gathered in the backyard for our annual family Christmas photo. It's something we've done for years, but this time felt different. My cousin had brought her new boyfriend, and he was eager to show off his fancy drone. He kept talking about how it could take amazing aerial shots, and how it would make our family photo epic this year. I remember feeling a bit uneasy about the whole thing. We've always just used a regular camera on a tripod, nothing fancy. But everyone else seemed excited about the idea, so I didn't say anything. We all started getting into position, arranging ourselves in front of the big oak tree that's been in our family photos for generations. My little niece, only 5 years old, was right in the front. She was wearing this adorable red dress with white frills, looking like a tiny Mrs. Claus. She was so excited about being in the front row this year, kept saying how she was a big girl now. The boyfriend started setting up his drone. It was bigger than I expected, about the size of a large pizza box with 4 propellers and a sleek black body. He was fiddling with the controls, explaining how it worked to anyone who would listen. I noticed my cousin looking at him with this mixture of pride and nervousness. Finally, we were all in position. The boyfriend stepped back, drone controller in hand, and started to lift it off the ground. The buzz from the propellers was loud, drowning out the Christmas music playing from the portable speaker nearby. I watched as it rose higher and higher, until it was hovering about 30 feet above us. At first, everything seemed fine. We were all smiling, trying to look natural as the drone's camera pointed at us. But then I noticed something odd. The drone was wobbling slightly, not holding steady like it should. I glanced at the boyfriend, and I could see a flicker of concern on his face. Suddenly, the drone lurched to one side. The boyfriend frantically moved the controls, trying to stabilize it. For a moment, it seemed like he had it under control. But then it jerked again, more violently this time. I heard gasps from my family members as we all realized something was very wrong. The drone started to spin, faster and faster. It was like watching a top lose its balance, wobbling erratically as it descended. My eyes darted between the drone and my little niece, standing obliviously in the front row, still smiling for the picture she thought was being taken. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the drone plummet towards us, its propellers a blur of motion. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen, unable to move as I watched the scene unfold in front of me. The drone struck my niece directly on the top of her head. There was a sickening thud, followed by the crunch of plastic and metal. My niece crumpled to the ground like a rag doll, the drone falling in pieces around her. For a split second, everything was silent. Then chaos erupted. Everyone started shouting at once. My aunt, my niece's mother, let out a scream that made my blood run cold. She rushed forward, pushing past everyone to get to her daughter. I snapped out of my daze and ran towards them too. My niece was lying face down on the grass, motionless. The pretty red dress was a stark contrast against the green lawn. As my aunt gently turned her over, I could see blood trickling from a gash on my niece's forehead. Her eyes were closed, and she wasn't responding to her mother's frantic calls. Someone yelled to call 911. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. As I tried to explain what happened to the operator, I watched my uncle scoop up my niece in his arms. Her body looked so small, so fragile against his chest. The decision to drive to the hospital ourselves instead of waiting for an ambulance was made in seconds. My uncle, still cradling my niece, ran to his SUV. My aunt climbed in the back seat, reaching out to take her daughter. I jumped in the front passenger seat without even thinking about it. The drive to the hospital was a blur. My uncle was driving faster than I'd ever seen him go, running red lights and swerving around other cars. In the back seat, my aunt was talking non-stop to my niece, begging her to wake up, to open her eyes, to give any sign that she could hear us. I kept turning around in my seat, trying to see if there was any change. My niece's face was so pale, almost as white as the frills on her dress. The blood from the cut on her forehead had smeared, making a gruesome mask across her features. Her chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths, but other than that, she was completely still. We screeched into the emergency room parking lot, tires squealing. My uncle didn't even bother to park properly, just stopped right in front of the doors and leapt out. He yanked open the back door and carefully lifted my niece out. Her head lolled back at an unnatural angle, and I felt my stomach lurch. As we burst through the ER doors, my uncle was shouting for help. The staff reacted immediately. A nurse rushed over with a gurney, and my uncle gently laid my niece down. In seconds, we were surrounded by medical staff, all talking rapidly and moving with practiced efficiency. They wheeled my niece away, disappearing through a set of swinging doors. A nurse stayed behind, peppering us with questions. What happened? How long had she been unconscious? Did she have any allergies? Was she on any medications? My aunt answered as best she could between sobs while my uncle stood there, looking shell-shocked. We were directed to a waiting area, a sterile room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines. The cheerful Christmas decorations seemed to mock us, a cruel reminder of what should have been a happy family day. I sat down heavily, the events of the last hour crashing over me in waves. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every time the door opened, we all jerked to attention, hoping for news, but it was always for someone else, some other family dealing with their own crisis. The room slowly filled with more of our family members as they arrived from the house. My cousin and her boyfriend came in last. He looked pale and shaken, and she was crying silently. Nobody said anything to them. What was there to say? The unspoken accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I don't know how long we sat there. It could have been hours or minutes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint beeping of medical equipment echoed from somewhere down the hall. Every so often, a burst of laughter or conversation would drift in from the nurse's station, a jarring reminder that for most people, this was just another day. Finally, a doctor in blue scrubs pushed through the door. We all stood up, a collective intake of breath as we braced ourselves for whatever news he was bringing. He looked tired, his face serious as he scanned the room trying to identify who he should address. My aunt stepped forward, my uncle right behind her. The doctor started speaking, his voice low and measured. I strained to hear what he was saying, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears I was afraid I'd miss something crucial. As the doctor continued to speak, I watched my aunt's face. Her expression shifted from fear to relief to concern and back again. My uncle's arm was around her shoulders, supporting her as she swayed slightly on her feet. The rest of us stood in a tense semicircle, trying to glean any information we could from the doctor's body language and the few words that carried to where we were standing. The boyfriend was at the back of the group, looking like he wanted to disappear into the wall. I caught phrases like severe concussion and monitoring closely. The doctor's tone was cautiously optimistic, but he kept emphasizing that the next 24 hours would be critical. As he finished speaking, my aunt burst into fresh tears, burying her face in my uncle's chest. The doctor said something about letting us see her soon, once they had her settled in a room. Then he was gone, disappearing back through the swinging doors, leaving us to process what we'd just heard. I sank back into my chair, feeling drained. The image of my niece lying motionless on the grass kept replaying in my mind. The sound of the drone hitting her head, the sight of her blood on the green lawn, the terrifying stillness of her body during that frantic drive to the hospital. We were all gathered in my parents' living room for our annual Christmas gift exchange. It's this thing we do every year, where everyone brings a wrapped gift and we take turns picking and stealing presents. Usually, it's a lot of fun, with people fighting over the good stuff and trying to get rid of the joke gifts. This year, though, it turned into something I'll never forget. The room was packed with family members, from my little cousins running around in their new Christmas pajamas to my grandparents settled comfortably on the couch. The tree was lit up in the corner and there was a pile of brightly wrapped presents in the middle of the room. We were all in good spirits, laughing and joking as we started the game. My aunt went first, picking a small rectangular box that turned out to be a set of fancy chocolates. Then my cousin chose a larger, oddly shaped package that ended up being a novelty waffle maker. It was all pretty normal, just the usual mix of nice gifts and silly gag ones. Then it was my uncle's turn. He's always been the jokester of the family, so we were all expecting him to go for the weirdest looking gift in the pile. He didn't disappoint, reaching for a small, cube-shaped box wrapped in shiny green paper. As he picked it up, I remember noticing that it felt heavier than it looked. He shook it a bit and we could all hear something sliding around inside. My uncle grinned, clearly thinking he'd scored something good. He tore off the wrapping paper, revealing a plain cardboard box. It looked like the kind of box you'd get from a specialty shop or something. My uncle opened the lid, peered inside, and suddenly his expression changed. It wasn't the look of someone who'd just gotten a funny gag gift. It was confusion, maybe even a bit of fear. He tilted the box and we all leaned in to see what was inside. That's when I saw it. A spider. Not a toy spider or a plastic one, but a real, live spider. It was about the size of a half-dollar coin, with a bulbous body and long, spindly legs. Its body was a mottled brown color with faint patterns that almost looked like a skull. For a second, nobody moved. We were all just staring at this spider, trying to process what we were seeing. Then my aunt screamed, and everything erupted into chaos. My uncle jerked in surprise at the scream, and the box tilted further. The spider, which had been sitting still until that point, suddenly scuttled out and onto my uncle's hand. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The spider, probably terrified by all the noise and movement, sank its fangs into my uncle's thumb. My uncle yelled and shook his hand violently, sending the spider flying across the room. Everyone started shouting at once. My aunt was still screaming, my cousins were yelling about killing the spider, and my grandma was demanding to know who had brought such a thing to our gift exchange. In the middle of it all, my uncle was clutching his hand, his face pale with shock. I don't know why, but I found myself oddly calm. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I was just the only one thinking clearly. I grabbed my phone and started searching for information about venomous spiders in our area. The image that popped up made my blood run cold. The spider we'd seen matched the description of a brown recluse, one of the most dangerous spiders in North America. I showed the image to my dad, and his eyes widened. He immediately took charge of the situation, telling everyone to calm down and instructing my aunt to call 911. My uncle was starting to look worse, his hand swelling visibly and angry red streaks appearing on his skin. While we waited for the ambulance, we tried to keep my uncle calm. His breathing was getting faster and he was sweating profusely. The bite area had turned an ugly purplish color, and the swelling was spreading up his arm. When the paramedics arrived, they took one look at my uncle's hand and immediately started treatment. They asked about the spider, and I showed them the image on my phone. They nodded grimly, confirming our fears about it being a brown recluse. As they were loading my uncle into the ambulance, one of the paramedics asked if we had managed to catch the spider. We hadn't even thought about that in all the chaos. A quick search of the room turned up nothing. The spider had disappeared. My dad decided to go with my uncle in the ambulance while the rest of us piled into cars to follow. The drive to the hospital was tense. My aunt was crying softly in the back seat, while my mom kept trying to reassure her that everything would be okay. But I could see the worry in my mom's eyes too. When we got to the emergency room, they whisked my uncle away immediately. We were left in the waiting room, surrounded by other families dealing with their own Christmas Day emergencies. The cheerful holiday decorations seemed out of place amidst all the worry and fear. Time seemed to crawl by. Every time a doctor or nurse came out, we all tensed up, hoping for news. But it was never for us. My younger cousins were getting restless, not understanding why we were spending Christmas in a hospital waiting room. The adults were trying to keep them entertained, but their forced cheerfulness only made the situation feel more surreal. Finally, after what felt like hours, a doctor came out asking for my uncle's family. We all stood up, a tight knot of worry and anticipation. The doctor's face was serious as he approached us. He explained that my uncle had indeed been bitten by a brown recluse spider. The venom was potent and had already started to cause tissue damage. They were administering antivenom and other treatments, but the next 24 to 48 hours would be critical. As the doctor spoke, I found myself thinking about that little wrapped box. Who had brought it? Was it some kind of sick joke gone wrong? Or had someone genuinely not known what was inside? I looked around at my family members, wondering if one of them was responsible for this nightmare. The doctor was still talking, explaining the potential complications and the long recovery process my uncle might face. He told us that my uncle would need to stay in the hospital for at least a few days, possibly longer depending on how he responded to treatment. Christmas was officially ruined, but that seemed like such a small concern compared to whether my uncle would be okay. We had this tradition of lighting a big bonfire in our backyard. It's something we've done for as long as I can remember. This year, my dad decided I was old enough to be in charge of it. I was excited, you know. It felt like a big responsibility, like I was finally being treated as an adult. I spent the whole day gathering wood and setting everything up. We live in a pretty rural area, so there's plenty of fallen branches and logs to use. I made sure to clear a big space in the yard, just like my dad always did. I even dug a shallow pit and lined it with stones, trying to make it as safe as possible. The weather had been dry for weeks, which I thought was perfect. No wet wood to deal with, right? I didn't realize then how dangerous that could be. As evening approached, I started arranging the wood in the pit. I used smaller twigs and branches at the bottom, then stacked the bigger logs on top. I was pretty proud of my work, to be honest. My family was inside finishing up Christmas dinner. I could hear them laughing and talking through the open kitchen window. I wanted to have the fire going by the time they came out, to show them I could handle it. I grabbed the lighter fluid and doused the wood pretty generously. Looking back, I probably used way too much, but I wanted to make sure it would light easily. I took the matches from my pocket, struck one, and tossed it onto the pile. The wood caught immediately. Flames leapt up higher than I expected. For a moment, I just stood there mesmerized by the fire. It was beautiful in a way, all orange and gold against the darkening sky. Then the wind picked up. It was just a gust at first, rustling the leaves in the trees around our yard. But it was enough to make the flames dance and sway. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how big the fire had become. Before I could even think about what to do, another gust hit, stronger this time. The flames bent sideways, reaching toward the dry grass at the edge of the cleared area. In seconds, the fire had jumped the stone border I'd made. I froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. The grass caught quickly, a line of fire racing across our lawn. I snapped out of my shock and ran to the garden hose coiled up against the house. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the faucet. Water sprayed out, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The fire was spreading faster than I could have imagined. The flames were getting close to the old wooden fence that separated our yard from our neighbors. I yelled for help, my voice cracking with panic. I heard the back door slam open, and suddenly my family was there. My dad took one look at the situation and told my mom to call 911. My brother grabbed another hose from the garage, but it was clear we were fighting a losing battle. The fire reached the fence, and within seconds, it was ablaze. I could hear our neighbors shouting now, and saw them running out of their house. The flames were so bright it hurt to look at them, and the heat was intense even from where I stood. Sparks were flying everywhere, carried by the wind. I watched in horror as one landed on our wooden deck. It smoldered for a moment before catching, and suddenly the fire was right there, just feet from our house. My dad was shouting instructions, telling us to grab buckets, to wet down the side of the house, anything to slow the spread. But it all felt futile. The fire seemed to have a life of its own, growing and moving with a terrible purpose. I could hear sirens in the distance, but they seemed so far away. Would they get here in time? The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe. My eyes were stinging and I couldn't stop coughing. Our neighbor's shed caught fire next. I could hear the crackling of the wood, the popping of nails as the heat warped the structure. Someone was yelling about propane tanks inside, and my stomach dropped. If those exploded? The firefighters arrived then, their trucks screeching to a halt in front of our house. They jumped into action immediately, unrolling hoses and shouting orders. I stood there useless as they pushed past me to fight the blaze. One of them directed a powerful jet of water at our deck, dousing the flames that were threatening to engulf our home. Others focused on the fence and the neighbor's shed, trying to contain the spread. I couldn't believe how quickly it had all happened. What started as a simple bonfire had turned into a raging inferno in minutes. And it was all my fault. The guilt hit me like a physical blow, making it hard to breathe. As I watched the firefighters work, I could see the damage clearly for the first time. Our once green lawn was now a blackened wasteland. The fence was gone, just a line of smoldering posts marking where it had been. Our deck was partially destroyed, and the side of our house was scorched. The neighbor's shed was a total loss, collapsed in on itself. I could see other spots in their yard where the fire had touched, leaving behind patches of ash and ruin. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastic and wood. Ash floated down like some twisted version of snow, covering everything in a gray film. The sounds of the fire engines, the shouts of the firefighters, and the roar of the flames all blended together into a cacophony of destruction. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene, even as tears blurred my vision. This was supposed to be a night of family tradition, of warmth and togetherness. Instead, I'd turned it into a disaster that had not only ruined our Christmas, but had put lives and homes at risk. As the firefighters continued to battle the blaze, I could see my neighbors huddled together, watching their property burn. The fear and anger on their faces made my stomach churn. How could I ever face them again? My family stood nearby, shock evident on their faces. My mom was crying, my dad looked grim, and my brother just stared at the fire, his expression unreadable. I wanted to apologize, to explain that I never meant for this to happen, but the words stuck in my throat. The fire chief approached us, his face serious beneath his helmet. He started asking questions about how the fire started, and I knew I had to own up to what I'd done. As I stumbled through an explanation, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. He listened quietly, then turned to survey the ongoing firefighting efforts. More trucks had arrived, and they seemed to be making progress. The main blaze was under control, but smaller fires still burned here and there. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a mistake that could be easily fixed. The damage was extensive, and the consequences would be long-lasting. I realized that this night would change everything, for my family, for our neighbors, and for me. The firefighters worked tirelessly, dousing hot spots and ensuring the fire wouldn't reignite. As the flames died down, the full extent of the destruction became clear. Our backyard was unrecognizable, a charred landscape dotted with the skeletal remains of trees and structures. The neighbor's shed was nothing but a pile of blackened rubble. I could see melted remnants of what might have been garden tools or outdoor furniture. The propane tanks, thankfully, had been removed in time, but the thought of how close we'd come to an explosion made me shudder. Our deck, where we'd spent so many summer evenings, was partially collapsed. The railing was gone, and the boards were warped and broken. The side of our house that faced the yard was scorched black. The paint bubbled and peeled from the intense heat. The beautiful old oak tree that had stood in our yard for generations was badly damaged. Half its branches were bare and burned, and I wondered if it would survive. The tire swing that hung from one of its lower branches was gone, leaving behind only a charred length of rope. As the firefighters began to pack up their equipment, an eerie quiet settled over the scene. The crackling of the fire was replaced by the drip of water and the occasional creak of cooling wood. Steam rose from the wet ashes, creating a ghostly mist in the cold night air. I stood there, taking it all in, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. This wasn't just about a ruined Christmas or damaged property. I'd put lives at risk. If the wind had been blowing in a slightly different direction, if the firefighters hadn't arrived when they did, things could have been so much worse. The fire chief was talking to my parents, probably explaining what would happen next. I could see my neighbors doing the same with another firefighter. There would be investigations, reports, insurance claims. The word arson floated through my mind, sending a chill down my spine. As the last of the fire trucks pulled away, their lights no longer illuminating the destruction, I was left standing in the dark, smoky yard. The Christmas lights on our house, miraculously undamaged, seemed to mock the devastation around them. What was meant to be a night of warmth and family tradition had turned into a nightmare of flames and destruction, all because of my carelessness. The acrid smell of smoke clung to everything, a constant reminder of what had transpired. I knew that scent would linger for days, maybe weeks, in our clothes, our hair, our home. It would be a long time before any of us could smell wood smoke without remembering this night. As my family slowly made their way back into the house, I remained rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene of devastation. The weight of responsibility, the crushing guilt, the fear of what was to come, it all pressed down on me, as tangible as the ashes beneath my feet. What had started as a simple family tradition had ended in a nightmare that would haunt us all for years to come. Every Christmas, my family has this tradition of playing touch football in the backyard after dinner. It's something we've been doing for years, ever since I can remember. This year was no different. We just finished eating, and everyone was in high spirits, laughing and joking as we made our way outside. The air was crisp, and our breath came out in little puffs of steam. The grass was a bit damp from the morning frost, but that never stopped us before. We split into teams just like we always do. My brother and I were on opposite sides as usual. Our cousin, who's a few years younger than us, ended up on my brother's team. We didn't have any real boundaries marked out, just the big oak tree at one end of the yard and the old swing set at the other. The teams huddled up planning our strategies, but it was all in good fun. None of us were taking it too seriously. Or at least, that's how it started. The game began, and it was pretty normal at first. We were running around, tossing the ball back and forth, trying to score touchdowns. There was a lot of laughter and playful trash talk. My aunt was cheering from the sidelines, and my uncle was playing referee, though he wasn't doing a very good job of it. As the game went on, things started to get a bit more competitive. My brother has always been the athletic one in the family, and he was really getting into it. He was running faster, throwing harder, and his tackles were getting a bit rougher. I noticed our cousin trying to keep up with him, pushing himself harder than usual. There was this one play where my brother had the ball. He was running towards the oak tree, which was our end zone. Our cousin was right behind him trying to make the touch. I was on the other side of the yard watching it all unfold. That's when it happened. My brother, probably caught up in the moment, forgot it was supposed to be touch football. Instead of just tagging our cousin, he full-on tackled him. It was like watching in slow motion. Our cousin's feet left the ground, and he went flying through the air. There was this sickening thud as he hit the ground. His head snapped back and struck something. We later found out it was an old tree root that had been hidden in the grass. For a second, everything went quiet. Then our cousin let out this weird gasping sound. We all ran over to him. He was lying there, his eyes wide open but not really focusing on anything. His body was rigid, and then suddenly, he started shaking. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. His arms and legs were jerking uncontrollably, and there was this horrible gurgling noise coming from his throat. Everyone started panicking. My aunt was screaming. My uncle was yelling for someone to call 911. My brother just stood there frozen, staring at our cousin. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. When the 911 operator answered, I tried to explain what was happening, but I could barely get the words out. She kept asking questions. Was he breathing? Was he conscious? I didn't know how to answer. I'd never seen a seizure before, and I had no idea what was normal or what to do. The operator told us not to try to hold him down or put anything in his mouth. She said to clear the area around him and try to time how long the seizure lasted. But standing there, watching him convulse on the ground, seconds felt like hours. My aunt was on her knees beside him, crying and trying to talk to him. My uncle had taken off his jacket and was trying to cushion our cousin's head. The rest of us just stood there, helpless, watching this horrifying scene unfold. The seizure seemed to go on forever. Our cousin's face was turning blue, and I was terrified he wasn't breathing. The sounds he was making were getting weaker, and I honestly thought we were watching him die right there in our backyard. After what felt like an eternity, the seizure started to subside. Our cousin's body gradually stopped shaking, but he didn't wake up. He just lay there, completely still, his eyes closed. I couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. The wait for the ambulance was excruciating. We could hear sirens in the distance, but they seemed to be taking forever to reach us. My aunt kept asking if anyone knew CPR, but none of us did. We were all just standing there, feeling completely useless. When the ambulance finally arrived, it was like a whirlwind. The paramedics jumped out and rushed over to our cousin. They started asking questions rapid fire, hooking him up to machines, shining lights in his eyes. It was a flurry of activity that stood in stark contrast to how still and quiet our cousin was. I watched as they put a brace around his neck and carefully lifted him onto a stretcher. They were talking about possible spinal injuries, skull fractures, and other terms I didn't understand, but that filled me with dread. As they loaded him into the ambulance, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. Just an hour ago, we were all sitting around the dinner table, laughing and enjoying our Christmas meal. Now, we were standing in the cold, watching as one of our own was rushed to the hospital. The paramedics were still working on our cousin as they prepared to leave. One of them was putting an IV in his arm while another was talking into a radio, relaying information to the hospital. They moved with a sense of urgency that made my stomach churn. My aunt climbed into the ambulance with our cousin. She looked back at us, her face tear-stained and filled with fear. The doors closed, and just like that, they were gone, leaving the rest of us standing in the yard, surrounded by the remnants of our interrupted game. The football lay forgotten in the grass. The goals we had marked out seemed meaningless now. The laughter and shouts from earlier had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. My brother hadn't moved from where he'd been standing since the tackle. He was staring at the spot where our cousin had fallen, his face pale and shocked. I wanted to say something to him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the words stuck in my throat. As the sound of the ambulance sirens faded into the distance, reality started to sink in. This wasn't just a minor accident. Our cousin could be seriously hurt. The possibility that he might not be okay hung over us like a dark cloud. The rest of the family started to move, grabbing coats and car keys, preparing to follow the ambulance to the hospital. But I couldn't shake the image of our cousin lying there on the ground, his body convulsing. The sound of his labored breathing and the sight of his blue-tinged lips were seared into my memory. Standing there in the backyard, the cheerful Christmas lights on our house seemed to mock the gravity of what had just happened. The contrast between the festive decorations and the scene of the accident was jarring. As we piled into cars to head to the hospital, I couldn't help but wonder how our family would ever be the same after this. What was supposed to be a day of joy and togetherness had turned into a nightmare. The uncertainty of what we would find at the hospital weighed heavily on all of us. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent. No one knew what to say. The Christmas carols playing softly on the radio felt out of place and were quickly turned off. The streets were mostly empty, with only a few cars out on Christmas evening. It felt surreal, like we were in some alternate reality where Christmas had been canceled and replaced with this nightmare. As we pulled into the hospital parking lot, I saw the ambulance that had taken our cousin. It was parked near the emergency entrance, empty now. Seeing it made everything feel more real, more serious. This wasn't just a bad dream we could wake up from. We rushed into the emergency room, a group of shell-shocked family members still in our Christmas sweaters and dinner clothes. The stark fluorescent lights of the hospital were a harsh change from the warm glow of our living room. The smell of antiseptic and the beeping of machines replaced the sense of Christmas dinner and the sound of carols. At the front desk, we tried to get information about our cousin, but the nurse couldn't tell us much. He had been taken for tests and scans. We would have to wait. So we sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other worried families, the cheerful holiday decorations in the hospital seeming out of place amidst the worry and fear. Time seemed to crawl by. Every time a doctor or nurse came out, we all tensed up, hoping for news. But it was never for us. The not knowing was almost worse than anything. Was our cousin going to be okay? Would there be permanent damage? The questions swirled in our minds, unanswered. As we sat there waiting, the events of the evening kept replaying in my head. The game, the tackle, the fall, the seizure. I couldn't stop thinking about how fast it had all happened. One moment we were playing and laughing, and the next, everything had fallen apart. The waiting room television was playing some Christmas movie, the sound muted. The cheerful scenes of family togetherness felt like they were from another world entirely. Our own family Christmas had been shattered, replaced by this nightmare of uncertainty and fear. It was Christmas Day, and I was in the kitchen with my sister-in-law. We were making the family's traditional Christmas pudding, just like we do every year. The house was full of people, and you could hear the chatter and laughter from the living room. The kitchen was warm from the oven, and the air was thick with the smell of spices and brandy. We'd been working on the pudding for hours. It's not a simple recipe. It takes time and patience to get it just right. My sister-in-law was wearing this festive red sweater with long, flowing sleeves. I remember thinking it looked nice, but it wasn't really practical for cooking. We were at the final stage of the pudding preparation, the flambé. It's always been my favorite part. There's something magical about setting the pudding alight and watching the blue flames dance over it. We'd done it dozens of times before without any issues. I poured the brandy over the pudding while my sister-in-law held the match. The brandy pooled around the base of the pudding, dark and fragrant. We exchanged a quick glance, both of us smiling in anticipation. She struck the match, and for a moment, everything was normal. As she leaned forward to light the brandy, I saw her sleeve dip slightly. It happened so fast. 1 second the match was approaching the pudding, and the next, her sleeve was on fire. The flames caught the loose fabric and raced up her arm in an instant. For a split second, we both just stared at it as if we couldn't believe what was happening. Then she screamed. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and hoped to never hear again. Raw, primal terror. She started flailing her arm, trying to put out the fire, but it only made things worse. The flames spread to her sweater, then her hair. The fire seemed to have a life of its own, growing and moving with terrifying speed. The heat was intense, and the smell, God, the smell. Burning hair and fabric and flesh all mixed together. I snapped out of my shock and grabbed a dish towel, trying to beat out the flames. But it was like fighting against a living thing. Every time I thought I'd smothered part of the fire, it flared up again somewhere else. My sister-in-law was still screaming, a continuous, piercing sound that cut through everything else. She was spinning around, trying to escape the flames that were consuming her. Pots and pans clattered to the floor as she bumped into the counter. The noise brought the rest of the family running. They burst into the kitchen, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. I saw the horror dawn on their faces as they took in the scene. My sister-in-law engulfed in flames, me frantically trying to put them out. Then everyone started shouting at once. Someone yelled to get water. Another person was shouting about a fire extinguisher, but in that moment all I could focus on was my sister-in-law. The flames had spread to most of her upper body now. Her face was contorted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. I grabbed her and tried to push her towards the sink, thinking we could use the spray nozzle to douse the flames. But she was panicking, fighting against me. Her skin felt hot, even through the parts of her clothes that weren't on fire. My brother, her husband, appeared next to us. He had grabbed the tablecloth from the dining room and was trying to wrap it around her to smother the flames. But she was moving too much, and the fire was too intense. The edge of the tablecloth caught fire, adding to the inferno. The kitchen was filling with smoke, making it hard to see and breathe. I could hear coughing and choking sounds mixing with the screams and shouts. The smoke detector started blaring, adding to the chaos. Someone finally appeared with a fire extinguisher. I remember feeling a moment of relief, thinking it would all be over soon. But when they tried to use it, nothing happened. It was old, probably hadn't been checked in years. The person holding it looked at it in disbelief, then threw it aside in frustration. By this point, my sister-in-law had collapsed to the floor. She wasn't screaming anymore, which was almost worse. The flames were still consuming her clothes, her hair. The skin, I could see, was red and blistering. The smell was overwhelming, acrid smoke mixed with the sickening scent of burning flesh. I dropped to the floor beside her, still trying to beat out the flames with the dish towel. My hands were burning from the heat, but I couldn't stop. I was vaguely aware of people shouting around me, of someone trying to pull me away, but I couldn't let go. Finally, someone came in with a large pot of water. They dumped it over my sister-in-law, and there was a hissing sound as the flames were doused. Steam rose from her body, mixing with the smoke that already filled the air. For a moment, there was an eerie silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the dying flames and the harsh breathing of everyone in the room. My sister-in-law lay motionless on the floor, her clothes and hair charred, her skin a patchwork of angry red and frightening white. I knelt beside her, afraid to touch her but desperate to help. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I couldn't tell if she was breathing. Someone was shouting about calling an ambulance, and I could hear someone else retching in the corner. The next few minutes were a blur. Someone was giving instructions, telling us not to move her, to keep her warm. A blanket appeared, and we carefully draped it over her, avoiding the worst of the burns. Her skin looked waxy and unreal, like a grotesque wax figure. I remember looking around the kitchen, taking in the devastation. The Christmas pudding sat forgotten on the counter, partially blackened. Scorch marks marred the cabinets and walls. Broken dishes and upended chairs littered the floor. The air was thick with smoke and the lingering smell of burned flesh and hair. The sound of sirens cut through the haze. They seemed impossibly far away, even though someone said they'd only be a few minutes. Every second felt like an eternity as we waited, watching my sister-in-law for any sign of movement, any indication that she was still with us. When the paramedics arrived, it was like a whirlwind of activity. They swept into the kitchen, their voices calm but urgent. They asked questions rapid fire. How long had she been on fire? What had we done? Did she have any allergies? I tried to answer, but my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. They worked quickly, assessing her condition, attaching monitors, starting IVs. Their efficiency was both reassuring and terrifying. They spoke in medical jargon that I didn't understand, but their tones were serious. As they prepared to move her onto a stretcher, I caught a glimpse of her face. It was almost unrecognizable, swollen, red, with patches of skin peeling away. Her beautiful long hair, which she'd been so proud of, was mostly gone, leaving behind a scorched, patchy mess. The paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher and I saw her flinch. It was the first movement she'd made since collapsing, and somehow it was worse than the stillness. It meant she could feel pain, that she was aware on some level of what had happened. As they wheeled her out, the full impact of what had just occurred hit me. What was supposed to be a joyful family tradition had turned into a nightmare in seconds. The image of the flames consuming her, the sound of her screams, the smell. It all came rushing back, overwhelming me. The kitchen, which had always been the heart of our family gatherings, now looked like a war zone. Broken glass crunched under my feet as I moved. The Christmas decorations seemed to mock us, their cheerful colors a stark contrast to the grim scene. Outside, I could hear the ambulance doors closing, the engine starting. The paramedics were still working as they prepared to leave, their voices muffled but urgent. The flashing lights painted the street in surreal shades of red and blue, turning our quiet suburban Christmas into something out of a nightmare. As the ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, unable to process what had just happened. The rest of the family was scattered around, some crying, others just staring in shock. The house, which had been filled with laughter and joy just an hour ago, now felt cold and alien. The pudding still sat on the counter, a blackened reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. The bottle of brandy that had started it all lay on its side, a small puddle forming on the floor. I couldn't stop staring at it, thinking about how such a small thing had caused so much devastation. In the distance, I could still hear the ambulance siren, growing fainter with each passing second. It was taking my sister-in-law away, to a future suddenly full of uncertainty and pain. And we were left behind, surrounded by the aftermath of a tragedy that had struck in the heart of our home, on what should have been the happiest day of the year. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.